Jupiter in the 11th house. This is episode 1. Look at the big picture about the template and the basic idea of what Jupiter in the 11th house symbolizes. And then we will follow this up with 12 more episodes, one for Jupiter in the 11th house in each zodiac sign. And for each zodiac sign, we will use one famous person's birth chart to explain how the template, the basic seed of the concept of Jupiter in the 11th house actually works in a real individual's chart. To begin our journey with Jupiter in the 11th house, let's start by remembering what Jupiter represents and what the 11th house represents. Jupiter is the planet of positivity. Positivity is the foundation of everything that Jupiter symbolizes. Positivity has one simple sense in which it just means optimism. That's why Jupiter signifies optimism, faith, trust, and a generous outlook. The more basic idea of positivity is the plus sign, and that's why Jupiter signifies increase, and hence it's associated with growth and success. Now, because it signifies increase, it signifies creation. That's why it has to do with children. Because it signifies children, it has to do with parenting the creators. That's why it has to do with role models like teachers and guides and priests and so on. Because it has to do with role models, it has to do with wisdom, and that's why it symbolizes philosophy and religion. And because it has to do with wisdom, it has to do with the contents of the wisdom. In other words, the ethics, the laws. That is what you need to know about Jupiter. Now let's get up to speed for what we need to know about the 11th house. The 11th house, as you can see here, physically speaking, is the eastern section of the overhead sky. In astrology, the eastern quadrant represents the manifest being, the self, and the overhead quadrant represents the visible world. So since the 11th house is on the eastern side of the overhead quadrant, it represents how the self benefits in tangible ways from the public, from the society. So we have social and we have cultural benefits from the world. This is why the 11th house has to do with communities. That's the primary social benefit. There's people out there that we can interact with. And what do you do when you interact with them? You socialize. That's what this 11th house has to do with socializing, building networks. It's a friendly house. It's not really about friends and friendship as like a relationship thing, but it's a friendly house. What else do you do with people in the world? You buy and sell, you trade, you exchange with them. That's why the 11th house has to do with commerce, and profit, and gaining. We also have cultural benefits from the public world, like all the arts that people make. That's why the 11th house has to do with arts. It therefore signifies the ability to create art, which is the talent, and also the ability to enjoy the art, which is like the taste. Now that we know clearly what Jupiter represents and what the 11th house represents, it's not too hard for us to figure out what Jupiter should symbolize if it's in the 11th house. All we need to do is look for places where Jupiter's symbolism kind of matches with or exactly disagrees with the 11th house's symbolism. For example, Jupiter has to do with increase and the 11th house has to do with gains, profit, increase. So what do you expect when Jupiter is in the 11th house? Pretty simple. You expect increase, a lot of gaining. What does it exactly mean in an individual chart? Well, that really depends on the exact chart that you're looking at that has Jupiter in the 11th house. It can mean all kinds of different things. Maybe it means you have a lot of weight. You gain a lot of weight. But in most cases, in and of itself, Jupiter in the 11th house really means you get a lot of money. And the things that come with money and the things that money comes from. So you have a lot of success and you have a lot of luxury. Here are the people whose charts we will be looking at in the 12 remaining episodes of this series. As you can see, they are very wealthy. In fact, we have the really heavy hitters in the world of wealth here. Steve Jobs, Gwyneth Paltrow, for example. The rest of them are also very, 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 very wealthy. And we even have Krishna in this list, who's like legendary mythical amount of wealth. There's another important way that the symbolism of Jupiter synergizes with the symbolism of the 11th house. It's the fact that Jupiter is very generous. And so is the 11th house in its particular way. It's friendly, right? And it likes to exchange things with people. So what we can say of Jupiter in the 11th house is the natives are probably generous. But I would like to make it a little bit more specific, because it's a particular kind of generosity that's very along the lines of the 11th house. What I would say is natives with Jupiter in the 11th house tend to have a lot come out of them when they're in front of people. In other words, they give a lot and they express a lot. So you can see that pretty well in this list of examples. And you can see how this might apply in its permutation to an unusual chart like Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi. Eyewitnesses who knew the man say that, in fact, he was very generous and loving towards his own people, towards his own family. But you can see how he's particularly, a lot comes out of him when he's in front of people. He gives these big rousing speeches and presents these big ideas and so forth. Even worse than the Nazi, however, would be Phil Spector. Again, you can see how we're not really talking about generosity per se as much as a lot comes out. This man is very expressive and he deals with expressiveness. He's in the music industry as a creator. So those two episodes where we look at these two charts will be particularly interesting. Phil Spector is Jupiter in Aries in the 11th, and we will look at his chart in episode 2. And Heinrich Himmler is Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 11th house, and we'll look at his chart in episode 10. Another important way that Jupiter and the 11th house are on the same page is that Jupiter represents creativity, and the 11th house represents art and the production of art. So if natives who have Jupiter in the 11th house should be artistically talented. They should be artistic. In fact, a particular type of artistry is probably performance art because of that generosity dynamic which we just discussed. A lot is coming out of them. They like to perform. This list again speaks for itself. We might wonder about the two exceptions on this list. Again, the Nazi Heinrich Himmler and also Steve Jobs. Well, Steve Jobs is particularly artistic in how he developed products. It will be interesting, however, to look at his chart in episode 5 when we cover Jupiter in Cancer in the 11th house to see why it became more of a technology artist rather than an artist. Heinrich Himmler, as I mentioned, we'll look at in episode 10 when we cover Jupiter in Sagittarius in the 11th house. It'll be interesting to see how this basic template of being artistic is that's what we expect from Jupiter in the 11th. Why does this man have very little artistic talent or proclivity? So stay tuned for those episodes. One final important way that Jupiter and the 11th house are on the same page. Jupiter represents the parent and the 11th house represents the friend. So see, this is where they're on the same page but not in agreement with each other. That's also important to look for when you're analyzing a planet in a house. So how is a parent different from a friend? It's in the archetype of how they exert authority. Friends are equals and parents are superiors. Friends discuss things, parents dictate things. So natives who have Jupiter in the 11th house will have an interesting dynamic going on with these two archetypes. The dictator versus the discusser, or the authority versus the peer. So you can say that people with Jupiter in the 11th house are not really the parenting type, but it doesn't mean that they don't love kids and have kids. It means really that they're not authoritarian in how they parent. That's the most likely outcome. In any individual chart, it may change. The basic concept may permutate a bit and have a little bit of a different angle to it. Sometimes even the opposite angle. But the expected thing is that they're non-authoritarian in their parenting model. It's not that they don't have kids or they don't like kids. Look at the list of people. Some of them have no kids. Some of them have tons of kids. Some of them are very unparenting. They're not the parents that you would want to have. Like, for example, Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi, or even worse example, Phil Spector. But many of them are really great parents who really love parenting. So it will be really, really interesting to look at all of these individual charts as we go through the episodes that cover Jupiter in the 11th house in those signs. Because now what you know is what Jupiter in the 11th house represents as a seed, as a template, as a baseline. What you need to do if you want to actually interpret charts with Jupiter in the 11th house is be able to figure out how that seed grows in the particular soil of that chart. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tara-Bala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.